Hey, good morning. It is August 19th. Fun Sunday this past Sunday. It was beautiful weather. 72 breeze blowing through the tent. I think more and more people are feeling comfortable and coming back to church, and it was really fun out there. This next Sunday, we wrap up Ruth. I put a book into the book of Ruth. Some of you are going, finally. But I always kind of grieve when I get through doing a book study because it's like, oh, I got to say goodbye for a while to an old friend. Having saturated yourself in a book for a long time, it's an incredible privilege. Here's the COVID-induced parental tweet for the day. Here's a mom who she says, was finally allowed to take my kids out for dinner, only to remember why I never previously liked taking my kids out to dinner. There were some positives of COVID. This past week, I'm reminded that some parents dropped their kids off to college, and I can still remember our first child, Whitney, when we dropped her off to college, and just kept prolonging, hey, we need to pick up this, hey, we need to get this, and then it just driving off. And we were living in Atlanta. She was at the University of Georgia, about an hour and a half drive, very similar to where, Lincoln is from Grand Island, distance-wise. And so I remember going back and sitting on the foot of her bed. The lights were off. The room was totally clean because she was moved out. And this overwhelming sense of, oh my gosh, life is never going to be the same. And so it was, I remember that like it was yesterday. So for those parents who drop their kids off, I know that feeling. The strange thing is, it's like it gets easier. It's different when you drop off the next ones to college. Ruth, in a time of uncertainty, demonstrates how we shall then live. I'm reminded by, in a time of uncertainty, words of encouragement for us. Psalm 31, verse 19 and 20. Listen to what it says. It says, how great is thy goodness. Obviously, it's talking to God. This is Psalm 31, verse 19. How great is thy goodness, which thou hast stored up for those who fear thee. It's this picture of God storing up his goodness for those who love him, which thou hast wrought for those who take refuge in thee before the sons of men. Before all our activities, it's like God has this goodness stored up for us who take refuge in him in the midst of uncertainty and tyranny. And then in verse 20, thou dost hide them in secret place of thy presence from conspiracies of man. That's poetry. Thou dost hide them in the secret place of thy presence from the conspiracies of man. In other words, God, all of man's plotting and conspiracies and evil intentions can't keep God's goodness from us. So just point of encouragement in the midst of our uncertainty. God's in control. And one of the messages that we glean from Ruth is that God is at work even in the midst of tragic circumstances. We know that, but yet it's so hard to live in light of the truth of that reality. And I mentioned this earlier several weeks ago, but I think when we are in heaven, we're going to see how all of the uncertain events, all of the events that we go, why is that happening? And how can you allow that to happen? That God we'll see in eternity how God folded them all together to achieve his perfect plan. And it'll be cause for us to kind of fall down on our knees and go, okay, you are God and I worship you and you alone. I'm also reminded that during this time, of difficulties that it's the difficulties that God uses to forge deeper character in our life. God's used the COVID to make us different. And if we have surrendered to Christ, then what happens is God uses that COVID to make us better, to drive our character down deeper, and to make the foundation of our life just more, just with fruitful, with the ability to flourish. So it's kind of like our life is like a soil, and our character is the depth of that soil. And God uses difficulties to make the depth of that soil deeper, and therefore our life more profound. I want to read Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 13, as we kind of plunge down a little bit deeper. It says, "Then she arose from her daughters-in-law," talking about Naomi, "that she might return from the land of Moab." By the way, this Sunday we'll draw a conclusion to Ruth, but interesting, it starts with Naomi, and then it pretty much finishes with Naomi. But so it says, "Then Naomi arose from her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab. For she had heard that in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food." In other words, she'd heard in Moab that there's bread back in Bethlehem. Remember, Bethlehem means house of bread. So now you've got bread back in the house of bread. Verse 7, "So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to her mother's house.'" She's commanding them, "Don't come with me." And then she says, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me," because obviously both of Naomi's sons are dead. And so now these two daughters-in-law, they're widows as well. So she says, "Go back home." And then in verse 9, she says, "May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband," meaning may you find a new husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices, and they wept. It's kind of they're saying goodbye to each other. They'll probably never see each other again. Naomi going on back to Bethlehem. The two daughters staying in Moab, going back to their families of origin. And they said to her, these daughters-in-law, "No, but we will surely return with you." They wanted to stay with her. And this is there's kind of a mystery here. Verse 11, "But Naomi said, 'Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons. Would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marriage? No, my daughters, for it's harder for me than for you. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." Again, let me remind you of that ritual that when you had a son that died, when you had a husband that died, the next relative, most of the time a brother, then would be able to redeem your story. So what Ruth is saying is, I don't have any other children. You guys are married women now. You've seen your husband die. If I have a child, it's going to be a long time before this child is old enough to redeem you and to marry you. So it doesn't look promising to stay with me. And she's discouraging them from coming with her. The question I ask, though, is why in the world these girls want to come with her to a new land, a land where God is present, where there's possibility of walking with God. And yet, Naomi, a believer in God, encourages her daughters, Orpah and Ruth, to go back to a system that worshiped foreign gods. Why would she do that? And I think the answer to that is most would argue that Naomi wanted to save face, because if she returns with these Moabite women, it's a kind of a billboard that, hey, you know what? They've made some mistakes. Her sons were not supposed to marry Moabite women. And so it's just an acknowledgement of the family sin. And so most would argue that she wanted them to stay behind because it would save face. Because then as she goes back, she could then form her story on exactly what happened. But if one of the daughters returned with her, she'd have an eyewitness, and therefore she couldn't fudge on her story. And it would be a constant reminder of her sin as well as her husband's sin. Now, obviously we know that Ruth returned with her. And God ordained that. God wanted Ruth to come back. But I've often asked the question, kind of a what if. Now, God is sovereign. And God was going to get Ruth back because God had a plan of putting Ruth in the bloodline of Jesus. But had she kept Ruth from returning with her, she would have undermined God's plan. But again, over and over and over again, God overcomes man's attempted course corrections where we take matters into our own hands. And if God wasn't sovereign and God wasn't orchestrating his plan, then what we would do is we would undermine God's plan. How would he ever get anything accomplished? But God can overcome our poor decisions. God can overcome our mid-course, in our own human wisdom, deceptive plans. And you see that over and over again. You see it in Abraham, you see it in Isaac, you see it in Jacob, you see it in Joseph's brothers, you see it here in Ruth, and specifically in Naomi. It's much easier to obey than to disobey. But even in the midst of that, the story of God is that he overcomes our poor choices over and over and over for his supreme plan to be orchestrated. Here's an exercise. Look back at your life. This is one of those personal things. Look back at your life, maybe tomorrow during a quiet time, maybe, in an evening sometime. Flip off the television set and ask yourself the question, all of the decisions that you made for the wrong reasons that God overcame. I can think of my background, high school and college, and as a young man, as a married man, as a parent, and taking matters into my own hands and a lot of small decisions. And yet God overcomes those. And I'm in a much better place, not because of my decisions, but because God orchestrated his plan and really spared me a lot of times, as he spared all of us from our own self-destructive ways. So just jot them down, and it's a testimony of God's faithfulness to his children. Have a great Wednesday, and look forward to seeing you this Sunday. Again, weather forecast looks like a great Sunday morning. So come join us out in the tent, or we'll see you at 10:30 inside. Have a great day.